remember the first time I came across the Mitchell case. It was one of those cold cases that grabs you by the throat and doesn't let go. Sarah Mitchell was just 7 years old when she vanished from a family camping trip in Oregon's Cascade Mountains on July 14, 1998. Her parents, David and Rebecca, had done everything right that weekend. They'd camped in a designated area, kept the kids close, and even had a buddy system in place. But here's what haunts me about missing children cases. Sometimes everything right still isn't enough. That Saturday evening, while her older brother collected firewood just 20 feet away, Sarah simply disappeared without a trace. No screams, no struggle, no witnesses, just an empty sleeping bag and a half-eaten s'more left by the fire. The timeline is what kept me up at night when I first dove into this child disappearance. Sarah was last seen at 7:47 p.m. when her mother took a photo of her roasting marshmallows. We know the exact time because of the digital timestamp. By 8:15 p.m., when Rebecca called everyone for dinner, Sarah was gone. That's a 28-minute window where a little girl vanished from a campsite with 17 other families nearby. I've studied dozens of unsolved cases involving vanished kids, and this narrow time frame is both a blessing and a curse for investigators. It meant the abductor had to move fast, which usually means mistakes. But in Sarah's case, it was like she'd evaporated into the mountain air. What made this one of the most mysterious disappearances in Pacific Northwest history was the complete lack of physical evidence. Search and rescue teams deployed within 2 hours. Bloodhounds, helicopters with thermal imaging, over 300 volunteers combing every inch of those woods. They found nothing. No footprints leading away from the campsite, no torn clothing, no signs of struggle. When you're investigating these heartbreaking stories, you learn that nature usually gives you something. A broken branch, disturbed soil, anything. But the forest had swallowed Sarah Mitchell whole, and for the next 15 years, her family would live in an agonizing limbo that the initial investigation treated this as a standard lost child scenario for the first 6 hours, which is where things started to go wrong. Park rangers assumed Sarah had wandered off chasing a deer or gotten disoriented in the dense forest. It happens more than you'd think with young kids in wilderness areas. But Rebecca Mitchell knew something darker was at play. She told investigators her daughter was terrified of the dark and would never venture beyond the campfire's glow alone. I've interviewed dozens of families affected by child abduction cases, and there's this gut instinct parents have that law enforcement sometimes dismisses too quickly. By the time they shifted from lost child protocol to potential abduction, precious hours had evaporated, and if someone had taken Sarah, they had a significant head start on an investigation that would ultimately remain unsolved for over a decade. What still gives me chills is the single clue that didn't make sense until years later discovered. A small, cheap disposable camera found 30 yards from the Mitchell campsite, tucked under a rotting log. It wasn't the family's camera, and none of the other campers claimed it. When police developed the film, they found 23 photos. Distant shots of children playing at various campsites, close-ups of the bathroom facilities, pictures of the parking area with license plates visible. The final photo, taken at 7:52 p.m., according to the Photolab's sequencing analysis, showed the back of a small girl in a pink jacket, the same jacket Sarah was wearing. Someone had been watching these families, documenting them, hunting. But in 1998, before we understood predatory surveillance patterns the way we do now with cold cases, investigators filed it as evidence, and the camera sat in a property room. Its dark storytelling potential waiting to be understood when technology and investigative techniques finally caught up to reveal its shocking truth revealed. The first 48 hours of any child disappearance case are absolutely critical, and I've seen how those initial decisions can make or break an entire investigation. By dawn on July 15th, the Deschutes County Sheriff's Office had transformed the Cascade Campground into a command center, something I've witnessed firsthand when covering these haunting cold cases. FBI agents specializing in missing children arrived by helicopter before most families had finished their breakfast. And suddenly, this quiet family camping area became ground zero for one of the largest search operations in Oregon history. They brought in cadaver dogs, dive teams for the nearby lake, and even consulted with psychics. Yes, in desperate missing persons cases, law enforcement will try anything when a child's life hangs in the balance. What struck me most about the Mitchell investigation was the sheer scale of resources deployed within those critical first hours. Over 800 volunteers showed up by the second day. parents from surrounding towns who couldn't imagine the horror Rebecca and David were living through. They formed search lines stretching miles into the wilderness, calling Sarah's name until their voices went hoarse, checking under every bush and behind every boulder. I've covered dozens of unresolved mystery cases where families felt abandoned by their communities, but this wasn't one of them. The emotional true crime element here is powerful. Strangers taking vacation days from work, camping out in their cars, refusing to leave until they found something, anything, that would bring this vanished kid home. But here's what haunts investigators about this family tragedy even today. Every single lead evaporated like morning mist. A witness reported seeing a suspicious white van near the campground entrance around 8 p.m., which sent dozens of deputies chasing down every white commercial vehicle in 3 counties. Another camper swore they heard a child crying from the direction of Highway 20 around midnight, triggering a massive search of the roadside areas. A psychic told Rebecca she saw Sarah near water, which had dive teams dragging the lake for 3 agonizing days. In true crime investigations, you learn that false leads can be just as damaging as no leads at all. They consume resources, exhaust personnel, and give families hope that gets crushed repeatedly. The search officially scaled down after 2 weeks, though David Mitchell refused to accept it. He quit his job as an accountant, liquidated their savings, and hired 3 private investigators to continue working the case, a decision that would eventually bankrupt the family, but also kept Sarah's story alive in local media. I've seen this pattern in so many shocking revelations cases. Families who sacrifice everything, becoming amateur detectives because they simply cannot move forward without answers. David created flyers with Sarah's photo and distributed them at every rest stop, truck stop, and gas station within 200 miles. He attended support groups for parents of abducted children, networked with other families living this nightmare, and built a database of similar child abduction cases across the Pacific Northwest. What he didn't know then was that his obsessive documentation would eventually crack the case wide open. But that breakthrough wouldn't come for another 13 years. And the truth would be far more disturbing than anyone imagined. By the end of summer 1998, the official investigation had hit a wall that's all too familiar in these disappeared without a trace scenarios. The FBI had interviewed over 300 people, generated thousands of pages of reports, and gotten absolutely nowhere. Sarah Mitchell's case went cold, filed away with thousands of other unsolved cases involving missing children that haunt law enforcement databases across America. But cold doesn't mean forgotten, and sometimes these mysterious disappearances just need time, technology, and one person who refuses to let the story die. When I started digging deeper into the Mitchell case files, I discovered something that plagues so many cold cases involving vanished kids, witness testimonies that contradicted each other so dramatically, you'd think people were describing completely different events. 3 separate campers reported seeing Sarah after 8:15 p.m., which should have been impossible since that's when her mother discovered her missing. One elderly couple swore they saw a girl matching Sarah's description walking toward the bathrooms at 8:30 p.m., holding hands with a tall man in a dark jacket. Another witness, a teenager from a neighboring campsite, claimed he saw Sarah sitting alone by the lake at nearly 9 p.m., throwing rocks into the water. These conflicting accounts drove investigators crazy because in missing children cases, you can't just dismiss eyewitness reports even when they make absolutely no sense with the established timeline. The man in the dark jacket became an obsession for investigators. But here's where things get really twisted in this unresolved mystery. 4 different witnesses described 4 completely different men. One said he was in his 20s with blonde hair, another described a middle-aged man with a beard, a third saw someone wearing a baseball cap and couldn't see his face at all, and the 4th insisted the man was actually a woman with short hair. I've studied enough true crime stories to know that eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable. Stress, darkness, distance, and the power of suggestion can make people remember things that never happened. But law enforcement had to chase every single lead, which meant hundreds of man-hours interviewing men who fit vague descriptions, pulling them away from tracking down legitimate suspects in this child abduction case. Then there was the gas station incident that nearly broke the case wide open, or so everyone thought at the time. 6 days after Sarah disappeared, a clerk at a Shell station in Bend, Oregon called police, absolutely convinced she'd just seen Sarah Mitchell with a man buying snacks and using the restroom. The description was eerily specific. Pink jacket, blonde hair and pigtails, a small butterfly bandage on her left knee, details that matched Sarah perfectly. Police descended on that gas station within minutes, pulled surveillance footage, and interviewed every employee. The heartbreaking story? The girl was actually Emma Parsons from Boise, Idaho, on a road trip with her father. She looked enough like Sarah to be her twin, down to the butterfly bandage. But this false sighting triggered 50 more Sarah sightings across 4 states over the next month. Well-meaning people who desperately wanted to be heroes in this shocking case, but who ultimately just muddied the investigative waters even further. What kept me awake while researching this case was the phone call Rebecca Mitchell received 3 weeks after Sarah vanished. A woman's voice, muffled and distant, whispered, "She's safe. Stop looking." Then the line went dead. Police traced it to a payphone outside a grocery store in Eugene, 90 miles from the campground. They pulled security footage, interviewed everyone who'd been in the area, analyzed the voice recording for any identifiable characteristics. Nothing. Was it a cruel hoax from someone who got off on this family's tragedy? Was it genuine information from someone involved in the abduction? Or was it Rebecca's traumatized mind hearing what she desperately wanted to hear in a random wrong number? These are the kinds of haunting stories that define cold cases. Fragments of possibility that could mean everything or absolutely nothing. The contradictory evidence created something dangerous in missing persons investigations. Investigative paralysis. Every lead pointed in a different direction, every witness statement undermined another, and the physical evidence, or complete lack thereof, suggested both a sophisticated abduction and a simple case of a child lost in the woods. By 1999, the task force had essentially split into 2 camps. Those who believed Sarah had been taken by an organized predator who'd planned this meticulously, and those who thought she'd simply wandered off and succumbed to the elements with her body hidden somewhere in the vast wilderness. Neither theory had enough evidence to move forward, and for the Mitchell family, this stalemate meant living in an unbearable limbo where hope and grief existed simultaneously. What nobody realized then was that the truth was darker than either theory, and the person responsible had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. The years between 2000 and 2013 were what I call the living death phase of the Mitchell case, that agonizing period in so many unsolved cases where families exist in perpetual limbo, unable to grieve, unable to move forward, trapped in a nightmare that never ends. Rebecca Mitchell told me in an interview years later that the worst part was not the not knowing. It was watching the world forget. Media coverage dried up after the first year. The anniversary vigils got smaller each July, and eventually even close friends stopped asking about Sarah because they didn't know what to say anymore. This is the reality of cold cases that most true crime content does not show you. The decades of silent suffering, the marriages that crumble under the weight of unresolved tragedy, the siblings who grow up in the shadow of a ghost. David Mitchell became a different person during those years. I've seen this transformation in countless families affected by missing children cases. He covered every wall of his home office with maps, timelines, photographs, and string connecting potential leads, like something out of a detective movie, except this was his actual life. He taught himself forensic science, studied criminal psychology, and joined online forums dedicated to solving child disappearance mysteries. Every vacation day, every weekend, every spare moment was consumed by the search for Sarah. Their son Michael, who'd been 9 when his sister vanished, grew up essentially without parents. His mother lost in grief, his father lost in obsession. This is the collateral damage of these heartbreaking stories that doesn't get enough attention. Entire families destroyed by one moment of violence. What kept the case from completely disappearing into the archives of forgotten mysterious disappearances was David's relentless advocacy work. He connected with other families living through similar nightmares and helped establish a database of missing persons cases across the Pacific Northwest, connecting dots that individual police departments working in isolation had missed. In 2005, he noticed a pattern. 3 other girls between ages 6 and 8 had vanished from camping areas in Oregon and Washington between 1996 and 2001. All disappeared during evening hours, all from sites near highways, all without leaving any physical evidence. Law enforcement had never connected these cases because they occurred in different jurisdictions, but David saw what trained investigators had somehow missed: a predator with a very specific hunting pattern targeting vulnerable children in wilderness areas. This discovery should have reignited the investigation, but here's the frustrating reality of true crime work. Pattern recognition isn't proof. The FBI reviewed David's findings, acknowledged the similarities were concerning, But without physical evidence linking the cases, they couldn't justify reopening them all or establishing a task force. I've seen this bureaucratic nightmare destroy families in so many child abduction cases. Parents who do the detective work themselves, only to be told it's not enough. David started attending camping areas himself, interviewing rangers, talking to longtime campers, showing Sarah's photo to anyone who would look. People thought he was crazy, this grieving father who couldn't let go, but crazy is sometimes what it takes to find shocking truth revealed in cases everyone else has given up on. By 2010, Rebecca had essentially given up hope, though she'd never admit it out loud. She'd packed away Sarah's bedroom exactly as it was the day she disappeared, creating a shrine that simultaneously honored her daughter and prevented any possibility of moving forward. She attended therapy, took medication for depression, and went through the motions of living while feeling dead inside, an emotional state I've heard described by dozens of parents in these haunting cold cases. The marriage was hanging by a thread, held together only by shared trauma and the unspoken agreement that divorcing felt like a betrayal of Sarah's memory. This is the hidden cost of unsolved missing children cases. Generations of suffering, families frozen in time, unable to heal because there's no body to bury, no closure to provide even the smallest measure of peace. What none of them knew was that the break they'd been waiting for was just 3 years away, and it would come from the last place anyone expected. March 2013 changed everything, and it started with something completely unrelated to Sarah Mitchell, which is often how these years later discovered breakthroughs happen in cold cases. A man named Robert Chen was arrested in Spokane, Washington, for attempting to abduct a 10-year-old girl from a grocery store parking lot. Standard protocol in these situations is to search the suspect's property and digital devices, and what investigators found in Chen's basement made seasoned detectives physically ill. He had a collection, and I use that word with absolute disgust, of over 3,000 photographs spanning nearly 20 years, all showing children at campgrounds, parks, and recreational areas across the Pacific Northwest. This wasn't someone who'd suddenly become a predator. This was a person who'd been hunting for decades, documenting his surveillance with the precision of someone who treated child abduction cases like a twisted hobby. When the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit began cataloging Chen's collection, a junior analyst named Michelle Torres noticed something that made her blood run cold. One photograph showed a disposable camera identical to the one found near the Mitchell campsite in 1998. Same brand, same yellow color, sitting on Chen's workbench among developing chemicals and other photography equipment. She cross-referenced the image date with the Mitchell case file, and suddenly 15 years of dead ends exploded into the most significant lead in one of Oregon's most notorious unsolved cases. What's terrifying about this discovery is that Chen had been living a completely normal life. He worked as a freelance nature photographer, attended community events, even volunteered at youth sports programs. This is the reality of predators in missing children investigations. They don't look like monsters. They look like your neighbor. The interrogation of Robert Chen became a masterclass in patience and strategy that I've studied extensively while covering true crime stories. He initially denied everything, claimed the photos were for legitimate photography projects, insisted he'd never harmed anyone. But investigators had him cornered with physical evidence, and they used a technique that works surprisingly well with narcissistic offenders. They appealed to his ego. They told him they'd studied his work, that his planning was sophisticated, that he was clearly intelligent. And slowly, over 16 hours of questioning, Chen began to crack. Not out of remorse, but because he wanted credit for how clever he'd been. This is the dark psychology of these shocking revelations. Sometimes predators confess not because their conscience bothers them, but because they want recognition for their crimes. On March 23, 2013, at 2:47 a.m., Robert Chen admitted to abducting Sarah Mitchell from the Cascade Campground on July 14, 1998. He described in chilling detail how he'd been surveilling the campground for 3 days, how he'd identified Sarah as his target because she wandered slightly further from her family than other children, how he'd used the distraction of dinner time to approach her and convince her he was a park ranger who needed help finding a lost puppy. The casual manipulation in his confession, the way he'd exploited a 7-year-old's innocence and desire to help, represents everything horrifying about child disappearance cases. He'd walked her calmly past other campsites, and because he looked official and Sarah wasn't crying or struggling, nobody intervened. By the time Rebecca noticed her daughter missing, Chen had Sarah in his vehicle and was already 20 miles away on Highway 20. But here's where the case takes a turn that still haunts everyone involved in this investigation. Chen refused to tell them what happened next. He admitted to the abduction, confirmed he was responsible for Sarah's disappearance. But when detectives asked the question every family in missing persons cases desperately needs answered, "Where is she?" he just smiled. He knew the location of Sarah's remains was his only bargaining chip, the one piece of information that gave him power over the investigation. He wanted a deal: reduced charges, better prison conditions, protection from other inmates who brutally target child predators. David Mitchell, sitting behind the two-way mirror during this interrogation, later said watching Chen negotiate with his daughter, his life like it was a business transaction, was the moment he truly understood evil. The FBI refused the deal, and Chen went silent, a silence that would last another 6 months before the truth finally emerged in the most unexpected way. September 2013 brought the breakthrough that would finally give the Mitchell family the answers they'd been searching for, though the truth would be far more disturbing than anyone anticipated. Robert Chen's ex-wife, Patricia Chen, came forward after months of internal struggle, a decision I've seen in so many true crime stories where family members wrestle with loyalty versus doing what's right. She divorced Robert in 2004, citing his obsessive behavior and emotional distance, but she'd never suspected the full extent of his crimes. After his arrest made headlines, she'd started having nightmares about a camping trip they'd taken in 1998, memories she'd suppressed for 15 years that suddenly took on a sinister new meaning. She told investigators about a storage unit Robert had maintained separately from their shared property, a unit she'd never been allowed to access during their marriage. One of those red flags that seems obvious in hindsight, but gets rationalized away in the moment. The FBI obtained a warrant for the storage unit in Redmond, Oregon, and what they found inside represented one of the most comprehensive documentation efforts in child abduction cases investigators had ever seen. Chen had kept journals, detailed, methodical records of his surveillance activities, his selection criteria, his abduction techniques, and most critically, what happened to his victims afterward. There were maps with locations marked, Polaroid photographs organized by date and location, and newspaper clippings about missing children dating back to 1994. This wasn't just evidence of Sarah Mitchell's case. This was a serial predator's archive spanning 2 decades across multiple states. When you study these haunting cold cases professionally, you develop a protective emotional distance. But detectives who processed that storage unit said they had to rotate personnel every few hours because the psychological toll was overwhelming. In journal entry dated July 14, 1998, Chen described abducting Sarah in clinical, detached language that made the crime somehow even more horrifying. He'd taken her to a remote cabin he'd rented under a false name in the Ochoco National Forest, about 80 miles from the campground, far enough that search teams never expanded their grid to include it. According to his writings, he'd kept Sarah alive for 3 days, photographing her before she died from what he described as complications from sedation. I'm not going to detail what those 3 days involved. Some aspects of these heartbreaking stories don't need to be shared publicly, and Sarah's family deserves that small measure of privacy. What matters is that Chen had buried her remains on the property, and he documented the exact location with GPS coordinates in his journal, almost like he wanted someone to eventually find his work. On September 18, 2013, 15 years, 2 months, and 4 days after she disappeared, Sarah Mitchell's remains were recovered from a shallow grave beneath a Douglas fir tree on that abandoned cabin property. Dental records confirmed her identity within hours, and finally, after over 5,000 days of not knowing, the Mitchell family had their answer. It wasn't the answer they'd hoped for during those early years when they still believed Sarah might walk through their door, but it was closure, a word that sounds hollow and insufficient, but represents something profound in missing persons cases. Rebecca Mitchell could finally bury her daughter, David could finally stop searching, and Michael could finally grieve for the sister he'd lost as a child. The forensic evidence also connected Chen to 4 other child disappearance cases that David had identified years earlier, making him one of the most prolific child predators in Pacific Northwest history. Robert Chen was convicted on 5 counts of first-degree murder, multiple kidnapping charges, and a list of related offenses that essentially guaranteed he'd die in prison. The trial revealed shocking truth revealed about how he'd operated for so long without detection. He'd specifically targeted transient locations like campgrounds where families were from out of state, had no connections to the area, and where local law enforcement had limited resources for extended investigations. He'd exploited the jurisdictional complications that plague missing children investigations, knowing that cases in rural areas often go cold faster than those in major cities. During sentencing, the judge called him a predator who weaponized the innocence of childhood and the trust families place in public spaces. Chen showed no remorse, even smirked when David Mitchell read a victim impact statement, which tells you everything about the kind of monster we're dealing with in these dark, storytelling cases. He's currently serving 5 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole at Oregon State Penitentiary in protective custody because even among criminals, child predators are considered the lowest form of life. The Mitchell case resolution brought closure to one family, but opened wounds for dozens of others whose children vanished under similar circumstances, cases that remain unsolved despite the patterns Chen's journals revealed. Investigators identified at least 12 other possible victims mentioned in his writings, children who disappeared from camping areas between 1994 and 2012, but Chen refuses to provide any additional information. This is the ongoing nightmare of cold cases. Even when you catch the monster, even when you prove what happened, there are still families out there living in the same limbo the Mitchells endured, still waiting for answers that may never come. And that's what keeps me investigating these mysterious disappearances, what drives me to share these stories. Because every case we solve, every predator we expose, potentially prevents the next family from experiencing this same devastating tragedy